and welcome to episode 3 of Cross-Chain Examination. I'm your host, Katherine Wu. So lately I've been thinking a lot about my own digital footprint, meaning, what makes up me in this digital world. And so obviously that went down a whole, train of thinking about my own user data, who owns it, whether or not I have access to it. And I think one of the big examples is probably the Facebook Cambridge Analytica scandal that people talk about a lot. And so obviously, in the light of that, I think privacy is probably more important than ever in this increasingly online world. And so our guest today is Henri Stern. So Henri's been someone that I've known for a really long time in the crypto world. And I think he's probably one of the most thoughtful and smartest researchers in the crypto space. So he's currently a founder of Privy, and we have him on today to talk about all things privacy. We talk about what data sovereignty really means, why it's important, and also we talk about the dangers of convenience online. So without further ado, here's the discussion. Our big topic today is privacy. So how to build for a future where we all as users can have more power over our own user data as we're browsing the web, accessing apps, and transacting online. And to discuss this with me today is Henri Stern, co-founder of Privy and an OG protocol research scientist in the crypto world. Welcome to the show, Henri.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, we're very honored that you're here. So I wanted to start off this discussion today by talking about privacy, specifically thinking about the world post the whole Facebook Cambridge Analytica data scandal. So as a refresher, a few years ago, whistleblowers leaked a report that revealed that personal data belonging to millions of Facebook users was collected without their explicit consent by this British consulting firm, Cambridge Analytica, predominantly to be used for political advertising. And I was listening to a couple of podcasts and blogs that you've written, and I know that you've said this yourself, which is, what happened here with Facebook wasn't really like a data security issue. Rather, it's kind of the result of bad system design and users maybe agreeing to things that they don't really understand or wasn't really made super clear to them. And so I guess in light of this or other instances like this, how has it shaped your thinking about the trade-offs in building data infrastructure? So specifically the trade-offs between convenience and privacy.
Yeah, I think this is really a key issue. And I think at the end of the day, you sort of got two, escape routes. I'm seeing a bowling lane with gutters. You've got two gutters. You've got a gutter on the one side, which is the system is made so complex with so much of a need for users to opt in and agree to everything explicitly that they just don't use it. And on the other side, you've got a system that automates everything, assumes intent on behalf of users so often that they're agreeing to things they don't know about. And so I think the reality is that in the Facebook Cambridge Analytica world, I believe that in all likelihood, users had explicitly agreed to this through Facebook's terms of service, through the fact that the way the app works, if you share data with a third party, and they can share it with friends of friends, which is how Cambridge Analytica got all their data. And so I think the reality is that this comes down to really poor UX. And so the way this has influenced my own thinking in systems building for this is really that systems have to be built with UX in mind. I think building sort of core permissioning systems or building systems that on a technical level can be made secure is not enough. I think developers and software architects and even data scientists and researchers have to be more opinionated in terms of how they're building out their systems and how their systems should play out down to the UX. And so I think this is where Apple has done a really good job, for instance, because Apple owns the entire stack from the hardware to the OS to some of the apps. But that means that when I say log into Uber, Apple gets to ask me, would you like Uber to have access to your location? And they can control that because they own the entire system down to the sort of telemetry that determines my location in the first place. So the challenge for us in Web3 and on the web in general is how do we do this without owning the entire application stack down to the physical world, down to the device? But yeah, I would say at a high level, what this has made me understand is really that the two sort of key themes in data privacy come down to sort of user control. And the name of the game here is informed consent, which is the UX issue. And the second is systems architecture. And that's more of what we're used to talking about in Web3 with regards to decentralization, with regards to how we use open systems to build more easily auditable and verifiable sort of data privacy infrastructure.
Yeah, this is exactly the kind of follow-up that I was thinking, which is like, we think a lot and we were both, so deep in the crypto world. And so, there's this funny meme that's like, crypto solves this. But in your instance, you're really building kind of a Web3 solution to this. So I guess zooming out, how does Web3 or how do blockchains seek to solve or mitigate this, this problem? And do you think it's like an apt or useful solution at all?
Well, and I think this is, to me, really where one without the other is not useful. So the short of it is, if blockchain builders, if Web3 developers rely on the underlying technical things without thinking through the user experience and the UX, then I think we get right back to where we were. And maybe what we've done is we've substituted trust in lawyers, which is, did you read the Facebook privacy policy, for trust in cryptographers, which is, do you actually understand what the hell a snark circuit does? And in both cases, the answer is no, I've not read the privacy policy, and I certainly haven't read the snark circuit. And so the real question is, I think, can Web3 be the sort of nexus for sort of transformative change when it comes to data sovereignty and informed consent? Absolutely, but only if we push beyond what is purely technical all the way down to the UX. And so I guess my point is, the best privacy solution for me is that which gets used. And so if we build really good primitives, but we don't basically convert our try all the way by going to the user, then I think it's all for nothing. On the flip side, if we build really good UX without any of the underlying primitives that allow us to verify that data is being used as it says, as a developer says, then it's an extremely brittle system. In my sense, Web3 is about ownership, and decentralization allows us to do this. What does it actually get us? What are the key features that sort of decentralization buys us? Or the first one I would say is transparency. Because data is in the open, we get verifiability, which means as users, we potentially get to see what is happening to our data. The second is control, which is to say the chain means that we all have our wallets with which we're custodying assets. And so the chain, in a sense, is sort of the custodial backstop to data ownership. At the end of the day, the data itself can be encrypted under keys I control, which allows me to take this data with me wherever I go. So it's the absence of lock-in. It's the fact that you can actually create whole new user experiences thanks to this world in which the user is in control in the end. And the last one is because of open standards in the space, we get interoperability. And I think this is kind of my key point, going back to the Cambridge point. I think the sort of core sin is that Facebook was building an opaque system. And this is the really cool thing about Web3, and the reason why I do think Web3 will be the nexus for change, is that in Web3, we're building for interoperability. We're building parts of the ISO layering of the stack such that people can build above and beneath it. And so I think my core sort of key point is these are really complicated questions, and they won't be solved by any single party. And frankly, they won't be solved, period. There is no silver bullet when it comes to privacy. What we can do is keep on building better and better systems, learn from users to present better UX so they can make informed choices, and then learn from sort of the evolving threat landscape on the web to better how systems architecture functions. But what that entails is building in the open, knowing that we're going to make mistakes and being able to own up to these mistakes. And this is kind of my big fear when I think about Web3's role in changing data privacy online, is frankly a lot of the zealotry that we're seeing all over the place. Like I see this debate around, say, soul-bound tokens and soul-bound NFTs. And you have on the one side the folks who are like, soul-bound NFTs are the future of identity, which I very much disagree with. And you have on the other side, chains are only good for financial transactions, which I also completely disagree with. I think the truth is, you need to use the right tool for the right problem. I think having sort of shared state through blockchains on a technical level as the backstop to identity systems is the way we get out of the marasm that's been, identity in Web2. But I think it needs to be done super, super deftly. For example, putting user data on chain is a terrible idea. Even putting encrypted user data on chain is a terrible idea. So
I was going to say, going back to your first point, the idea of, so transparency is held to such a high degree in the Web3 crypto space because, everything in the blockchain is open and transparent. So how do you square away, transparency, the blockchain, and privacy?
Let me give you a thought experiment. Okay. So I have three things, or I guess not really a thought. We'll see what it is. But let's assume you're trying to share your social security number with a DApp for whatever reason. There's sort of three levels at which you could do this transparently. The first is you share it with the DApp. This is a smart contract. your SSN goes on chain, encrypted, unencrypted. For all intents and purposes, I don't care because ciphers break over time. The ciphers we use today are not the ciphers we use in 50 years. One of the great points of blockchains is for them to be long-lived, is for them to be robust. And so if this data is going to be on the web forever, you certainly don't want the sort of core underlying data, even encrypted, to be on-chain. So that's the first option. The second option is the data is held off-chain, but the actual permissions, who gets to read it, is held on-chain. And it's better, certainly, because I can't read off Katherine's SSN from the chain, but I can know that Katherine is okay with Henry having access to the data, but Bob not having access. So now Bob can come after you and say, wait, what the hell? You just gave Henry access and you're not giving me access. So permissions themselves are still yet another part of transparency. And then this is where zero knowledge proofs can come in to a third system, which is a system in which actors are making claims about data and about permissions and access. These claims are coming on chain, but basically these claims don't mean anything unless there's a need for dispute resolution. So this is the same way state channels work generally, which is a lot of activity happens off chain, but the chain is the end settlement layer on which if as a user you claim, DApp abused my data and used it in a way I didn't allow, you can actually have a proof for it. And on the flip side, the DApp can say, no, here are the people we gave access to and here's how they accessed it. So I think that the chain has sort of this public state, this verifiable resolution layer for data access and for identity data is really, really important. And it's what allows us to basically build systems that not only can be more trusted, but I think more importantly, are interoperable. Again, I think the point for me here is there are two parts to why blockchains are important. First, it's let's make sure, Alpha DApp is not lying to you about what they're doing with your data. The second is, Alpha DApp may exist for 5 years, for 10 years, but your identity in the online world exists forever, or at least for as long as you're alive. And so we need to have a system that can be iterated upon so that once Alpha DApp ceases to exist or moves on to do something else, Bravo DApp can use your identity and Charlie DApp can use your identity and Delta DApp can use your identity. And basically your identity, just as you, a living thing, can evolve through the on-chain interactions that you have. And so this is one of the parts where I'm super excited for the potential for interoperability in Web3, which means that we're not stuck with, you've chosen to buy into the Facebook ecosystem. Basically, you either use our app, or you lose all of the data that was there. I think choice is really the important thing that blockchains get us.
So aside from being able to port your own data, you also talked about giving permission, which I think are really core to, at least in my mind, what it means to own your own data, right? So, I think this ties back really nicely, I think, to what you're building at Privy, right? Which to me means, you're building a solution that will enable this kind of data sovereignty. So again, like I said, in my mind, data sovereignty is the power to own your own data and decide what you want to who you want to give permission to and who you don't, right? That choice is at least yours. Help me define what data sovereignty means in a broader kind of landscape. And also, how do you think some of these real world use cases can Privy actually enable?
Yeah. So I would define data sovereignty as probably three things. The first is expressive and revocable permissions. Not simple, predicates, and here I think back a lot to, say, GDPR consent banners. You either agree or you get the hell out of here. And that is not an expressive permission. I think the permission should be a lot more nuanced, which is what data do you want to share, and not if you don't share any, then it can't work. The second is data portability. I get to take my data with me wherever it goes. I am the source of truth for that data. I think the state of the web today is if I sign up to 19 services, my data exists in 19 different places, and I'm only as safe as the worst of these services that's taking on my data. And so it should be flipped. It should be that data belongs with me and I open or close access to various services. And that gets me to the third point, which is centralized control. And I use the word centralized here, I think, on purpose. It's a little tongue in cheek, but it should be centralized around me. I should be the person to decide, not some blockchain that I lose control over. And so those are, I think, the three sort of key features for me of data sovereignty, which is expressive revocable permissions, data portability, and centralized control. And all of that comes together basically to create a world in which, as an end user, my data is fluid, follows me throughout the web, but basically acts as I do and with the amount of impermanence that I want. And so it is the ability for me to control who has access to my data for how long and how much of it at a high level. Now, I think the really tricky thing, and this is the part that strikes me as one that a lot of people who are working on data sovereignty forget, is that it sort of takes two to tango. You have the user who's excited to use a product, but you have the developer who needs to be able to build. And, another reason why Apple, say, may have been quite successful is because, say, Swift or Objective-C before it, these are good, Xcode is a fair IDE in which I can build good apps. And so the question on the flip side is, how do you allow developers to build in a data sovereign world? And this is kind of what we're trying to get at Privy, which is to say, how can we help level the playing field so developers can be responsible with user data, can build good products that respect data sovereignty on behalf of the user, but not have to basically juggle all of the different parts that make up data identity. I think it's too much to ask for somebody trying to build a DApp to have to reinvent the identity stack as a whole. And so I think our role is to really sit between the user and the developer and help the developer with a toolkit that allows them to make choices on behalf of what data they need for their app, and that keeps the user in the driver's seat so they can do this. So to answer your question, Privy really is a simple way for developers to take better care of their user data. It's a pretty simple API, has two main calls, put or get, that are called directly from the browser, and it allows a developer to take on sort of off-chain data associated as part of an encrypted by default and end-to-end encrypted data store associated by default to user wallet without having that data go on-chain.
How does Privy actually work today, and how do you see it kind of changing in the long term? And by the way, I think a lot of what you're saying is, actually made me think of a question, which is, do you think that data sovereignty should be a design choice? Do you think it should be kind of on the users to think about this? Are devs solely responsible for making these choices?
It's a really great question. And I think the reality is it's a spectrum, but we should define where the spectrum begins and ends. I'll give you an example. The version of data sovereignty, quote unquote, that we have today with GDPR, which is no data sovereignty at all, is basically a false choice. As a user, you come into our site and you either get a fully broken experience or actually us turning you away, or you agree that we do whatever the hell we want with your data. The way in which, say, privacy policies work today, where they can be updated out from under you, you're expected to read through this legalese, that is a false choice. So clearly, that is not the right place where the spectrum begins. I think the spectrum should begin with the version of informed consent. And I think, the idea that just by using the product, users have consented is not right. The fact is you don't know what you're agreeing to when you use a product. And so finding the language and building UX such that users can consent to things, even if they don't control the underlying use of data, they can verify how it gets used, is to me sort of on the one end of the spectrum. On the other end, you might have the user gets to decide every time they give you access to data. And so from a UX perspective, this is the difference. Say, if I'm about to share an email with a DApp, this is the difference between the DApp having to ask me for email access every time they want to send me an email versus the DApp being able to send me email because I agreed to it once. And obviously, based on the piece of data that you're handling, it might or might not be the right solution. Like, say, I shared my SSN with you. Potentially, I do want you to ask me every time you need to unlock it in order to generate a legal document or something like that. Whereas, say, with email, I certainly don't want to have to be there and agree to the email every time you want to send me one. The point of it is that you should be able to reach out to me without me being there. So that's why I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all solution to data sovereignty, but I think it should sit between a place where basically the user is unable to give informed consent. So it should sit in a place where you have transparent controls and the user can trust but verify. And on the other side, to a place where access control is so granular that basically, you're sort of throwing the kitchen sink at the problem. This is the part of crypto that kind of annoys me, is when developer says, well, if you're unhappy, you can just go ahead and fork it. And it's like, well, we're back to the same thing as the GDPR point, which is it's a fake choice. And so if you tell me, well, if you're unhappy as a user, you have all of these settings that you can determine yourself, just run your own node and so on, that's no solution at all. And so I think this has to be baked on good UX, and these have to be revocable permissions. Those are the two sort of, I think, things without which you can't get data sovereignty.
You know what this reminds me of? It's not exactly related, but there's this one op-ed that I think about a lot. So it's written by Tim Wu. So he was a professor at Columbia, and now he's in the Biden White House in charge of technology policy. But he wrote this op-ed in the New York Times, I think in 2018 or maybe a few years ago. But so it's titled "The Tyranny of Convenience." And so what he says is basically like, things are getting easier, right? When I say things, that can mean anything. It could be washing machines. It could be browsing whatever web pages. It could be clicking the I accept just to use something, right? So he's basically saying, as tasks get easier, then like there's this growing expectation that convenience actually puts on, which is that everything else needs to be easy or to be left behind. And so he kind of argues that we become spoiled by the kind of immediately, right? Like we immediately get what you have, and then you get really annoyed by anything that requires any effort and time. And so basically what he's trying to get at is this be easier or left behind dichotomy, which is what you're saying. It's actually kind of a false choice. And, where he's getting at in the article is really just embrace the struggle. Sometimes you want to go through the process. So anyway, that kind of reminded me of what you're saying, which is that when you're giving it accept or get the F out, that's not a real choice. And so that applies to your data, that applies to really any experience, whether it's on the web or not.
But I think this is why it's so exciting that we're working on privacy in Web3 and that there are a lot of people working on data sovereignty in Web3. It's because at the end of the day, this is a massive coordination problem. How do we make it that we can build a better system for everybody, even though everybody does not care about it in the same way or to the same level? Beyond the technical and the UX choices, there's a coordination problem here. And this is one of the things Web3 is really good at. Because these systems are transparent, because they're interoperable, we actually, hopefully, get to build sort of a common bedrock for data privacy that is usable by developers, that allows me, if I want to build something, to not have to rip my hair out in order to take better care of user data. But that also gives the user some floor as to protection. And so I think a lot about this in ecological terms, or I think animal cruelty here is the interesting one. There's a lot of efforts around labeling food items in supermarkets, so you can know that your chicken eggs were made by free-ranging chickens, or that this is grass-fed beef that you're buying. And this comes from a coordination effort. I suspect a lot of people don't care, but hopefully, one, there's a crew of buyers who cares enough to make it a purchasing power decision. Two, regulation steps in and also does. And so I think this is sort of my core idea is that any of these solutions will not be built in isolation. We need to come up with standards. And so to go back to your original question about how Privy works, Privy really takes care of three things: encryption and key management, permissions, and storage. When you type in a piece of private data in your browser, a call is made to the Privy KMS, the key management system, and that key management system is backed either by a secure server that only takes care of keys that we host on your behalf, so this is a hardware security module, or by your Web3 wallet. And depending on which it is, we generate a new set of keys, and data, your private data, is encrypted in the browser using those new sets of keys. So that ciphertext is then sent to the Privy storage system, locked by the permissioning system. But the point I'm getting at is this entire system is built super modularly, because our assumption is we can't be the ones to run everything over time. In fact, we shouldn't be. However, the first order of work for us is let's get the interfaces right. Let's get the UX right. Because I think if we don't get the UX right in the next 2 years, the tyranny of convenience will win over. And Web3 as a whole, I think, is going to move to look a hell of a lot more like Web2. Web3 is going to move to a place where developers, because they don't have any other choice, are just dumping data into Postgres. And basically, Web3 becomes a financial application once again. And so I think in order for data ownership, in order for data sovereignty to be a part of Web3, we need to fix UX problems. And then we need to decentralize our systems, which is why we've built Privy as we have, very modularly. But today, we run infrastructure so that we can really focus on getting the user experience right, on getting the developer experience right, and then open up the infrastructure so that you can run your own node for the permissions agent that gates access to data, so that you can store the data, not necessarily, say, in our cloud provider, but on IPFS or wherever you will. Again, I think it's about the right tool for the right problem, and the right tool is not the same for everybody.
Do you think with the way that Privy works today or in the future, would you have built basically a different business model or a different business at all if this was building for the Web2 world versus the Web3 world? And how so, if it is different?
So I think from an actual sort of what we're striving for is to build an API that is the same in both worlds. So I think that's one of the really exciting things for us. And frankly, it's because I think a lot of API tooling is much better in Web2. I think I go to a lot of Web3 websites and I feel like I have to get a PhD in order to understand how the thing is working. I feel like I have to, read reams of docs. People are throwing white papers in my face. And I'm like, how, I just want to get something to work. So that's why we've built it with that bar in mind, which is to say that the experience should be indistinguishable, whether you're using it for Web2 or Web3. And in that sense, the big difference is going to be where is the infrastructure actually running? For example, are you authenticating with your own auth system or with Okta in Web2? Or are you authenticating with something like signing with Ethereum or another blockchain auth system, or in this case, key signing system? And then who's running the infrastructure? Is Privy running infrastructure on your behalf, like any hosted SaaS platform? Or actually, are you running it through a network of nodes? So that is probably the first distinction is at an architectural level, there'll be differences on what's happening behind the scenes, even if those don't show up through the interfaces. I think in terms of business model, the second thing actually I want to get to is the fact that users control their own keys in Web3. And I really think that is a transformative change. And so I think one of the most important issues in the space right now is the question of key custody. I think, social recovery, I think key management and better wallet interfaces are so important, because if we give up on sort of non-custodial solutions, then a lot of, I think, the core advantages of Web3 go away. So the fact that in Web3 users have their own keys, that today they're using the custody assets, but that they can use the custody data, is to me a really essential part of also the difference here. And this is something we're very interested in, which is basically how do we bridge the gap between Web2 systems, Web2 auth systems, and Web3 auth systems through key management. On the business model point, and this is the third and last piece, the reality is we're open sourcing a lot of our work, and we're excited to build basically a part of this infrastructure stack that is going to have to exist around data infrastructure, in part because token economics exist, or crypto economics exist. I think the reality of the last 30 years of the web is that users will not pay for privacy, and users will not pay for their own data management. I think any solution that caters to a user and is basically a paid service where, you pay $20 a month and you get privacy, is just, to me, an unsound business model. This is where, both the tyranny of convenience and just force of habit makes that unpalatable to the modern web user. And so the question then is, who should have to pay? And obviously the answer is the developer. But if I have a data store that is shared amongst apps A, B, and C, if Uniswap and Mirror and Fractional all have access to my data and I'll use it, who should be paying for it, right? Are they paying based on the number of accesses? What if, I first signed up and basically built up my data store, my data vault through Uniswap? Should Uniswap be rewarded for onboarding me into a sovereign data system? And this is where crypto economics are actually really excellent, is we can actually build this sort of massive coordination solution so that data accesses and data rights can actually sort of either be paid out or accrue value to the people who are using the underlying user data. And so as a business, you have your own monetization model, but you're paying for the right to serve that customer. And so this is a major way in which I think a lot of the architecture design behind Privy has been shaped, is in knowing that that is the end goal we're going towards, and that I think that is how data sovereign systems should work.
Do you think that all of, or most builders and also users within Web3 share this ethos of having that choice, having the sovereignty, having data sovereignty? And does that make them the ideal kind of users for you in the beginning? Just because I think people go into Web3 because they're a little bit fed up with the Web2 models and how you feel like you don't really have, a choice, like we talked about, and how all the power is, centralized within one platform. And so as a user, you kind of don't have a choice. Do you think that, what makes it a good kind of, ground to build Privy and to build towards that? And do you think Web2 kind of companies or Web2 users or Web2 platforms can eventually also get onboarded?
Yeah, I mean, my contention is that the distinction is going to go away. And so in the future, there will be no Web2 or Web3. There'll be a question of how the infrastructure and how the stack is built. And, shared state systems, which is a geeky way of saying blockchains, will be a part of major infrastructure. And so, 30 years on, I suspect that is exactly how things will end. And Web2 companies will have learned from it, because Web2 companies will have integrated the best parts of Web3 infrastructure within their stack, and vice versa. To get a little bit lower level, I think all people in Web3 don't share the ethos. And I think that's completely fine. I've seen a number of builders in Web3 who are really here because they get to build novel experiences or they get to monetize in new ways. And they're attracted by basically some of the freedoms that Web3 gives them in terms of tooling, in terms of UX, in terms of all of that. And this is where, frankly, regulation is our friend, in that the regulatory landscape, in trying to protect users, has built the grounds for developers saying, I really don't want to touch user data. Please get me out of this custodial nightmare. And so whether you're doing it because you have great ideology and you're like, I want to empower users, or whether you're doing it because you don't want to have to deal with the legal overhead of owning the user data, that leads to the same system, which is one in which the developer only has access to the data if the user so wishes. I think the real question is going to come down, though, to what users are willing to put up with in terms of friction and in terms of UX. I have no doubt, basically, that the users will determine how far the UX can evolve towards user empowerment, which is why we have to unlock really delightful UX around data management. Because without that, developers will not sacrifice, basically, their business, their product, their dream in the name of building something that is like purer from an ethos standpoint. So that's kind of my take on it, which is thankfully, incentives have aligned in a way that's really unique in Web3 today, which is why I think it's such an important time to be working on this issue. And I think the next couple of years are going to be key. But I think one point I just want to double down on is I don't think this is only going to come through pain or fear. This is not just, I worry about the SEC or the CFTC coming after me, and so I don't want to know about any of my users. I think this is really about unlocking new experiences. I think what you can do with sovereign data systems as a user, this is the most boring example, but as a user, the fact that I can move from, say, New York to California and update my address once, and it's updated in all the systems I use online, having a digital data passport that I can travel with, like the sky's the limit with what you unlock if you have built secure data systems that respect user wishes on top of decentralized rails. So I really am excited for us to get through this first phase of actually jump-starting the sovereign data machine into, I think, the next phase, which is really, I think, a far more human-centric sort of web experience that we get thanks to this.
As our interactions with the world and other people become increasingly online, I really like this idea of a digital passport, right? And, a passport is mine and I own it. And if I want to go somewhere, that's my choice to kind of use it. And so, kind of taking that comparison, our data, where it goes, who gets to control it, who gets to access it, where I get to take it just becomes ever more important. And I'm so glad you're building towards this vision. Henri, thank you so much for coming on the show, sharing with us the Privy vision and talking to us about a future where the choices are real, we avoid the tyranny of convenience, and we have true data sovereignty.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
Thank you everyone for tuning into episode 3 of Cross-Chain Examination. If you haven't already, definitely go check out our first 2 episodes. Please like and subscribe wherever you're getting this podcast, so whether it's on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and the like. Leave me any thoughts, questions, suggestions for future episodes. Thank you again, and I'll see you next week.